So next, Susan Taylor Batten, as I said earlier, is the president and CEO of ABFE, ABFE, which is the Association of Black Foundation Executives. Before joining ABFE, Susan was a senior associate with the Annie E. Casey Foundation, where she was helping communities and other partners transform neighborhoods into family supportive environments and working within the foundation to address racial disparities in grant making. Previously, Susan was vice president at the Center for Assessment and Policy Development. She worked at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Food and Nutrition Service, where she oversaw national evaluations of federal child nutrition programs and helped to increase access to food programs for the homeless. She worked for the government in D.C. On comprehensive children's initiatives. She's the co-founder of the Race and Equity and Philanthropy Group. She's won many awards in that arena. And because this conversation is so important to her, Susan postponed her vacation trip to Jamaica, where she is buying a vacation condo, so she postponed her closing to be here. So thank you, Susan, and welcome, Susan.
Hello, how are you? Great, thank you so much. It's bright up here. Ooh, I didn't realize how bright. That was great. Thank you so much for that. Learned a lot. I am glad to be here. Thank you, Karen, for inviting me. It's good to be in Colorado. I'm going to use a podium. I have been on a whirlwind tour around the country. I just left Karen's great state of North Carolina, and I am actually off to the beach in a couple of weeks. So if I'm looking at you with big smiles, it's because you guys stand between me and Jamaica. So really good to see you guys. I'm standing behind a podium because the first thing I'm going to do is take my shoes off, right? You guys can still see me, right? Okay. Okay, the altitude is sort of getting to me. I realize that. And so the advice I got was drink a lot of water, but I can't drink a lot of water and get on stage. I just can't do that. So I'm going to use the podium sort of to hold on to. I am really pleased to be here. I'm going to jump right in because I'm going to give you a lot of content, but I'm really glad to follow my colleagues. And you all have had a number of great sessions, and I was thinking, what is it that I could possibly bring you that is new and different? And perhaps maybe some things would be a little new. But you know, I think it's important to say that working on issues of equity is lifelong work. It's lifelong work. We are all learning. It's a journey. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And so my hope is that with all of the sessions, including what I'm going to share with you this morning, you can just take bits and pieces from all of our comments and all of our ideas to help you advance what is critically important work, and I just want to thank you for that. So what I'm going to do is share with you three things this morning. First, I want to talk to you a little bit about ABFE, how we actually look at equity. And I should say that I'm going to focus mostly on racial equity, and I can talk a little bit about that through the conversation as to pick up actually on some of the points that Karen made about why we think coming through the door of race ultimately gets you to gender, sexual orientation, and the like. So I'm going to focus mostly on racial equity. The second is that I just want to share sort of some basic concepts and definitions. I have to say, we do foundation, board, and staff training around racism and racial equity, and I think we always make the wrong assumption that people have a shared language and set of definitions around words like equity, for crying out loud, or race or racism. And I find that's a lot of what people stumble over when they're trying to have what is already a hard conversation, is just, are we in the same discussion? So I want to talk a little bit about definitions. And then third, talk a little bit about what's going on in philanthropy, because that is the work that we do at ABFE, and then point you to a few tools that may be helpful in your work that we're promoting at ABFE and sort of trying to get through the foundation sector. So I'm going to do all of that at a very high level because I have 30 minutes. Just 2 points of context. My colleagues really just helped us understand implicit bias, but did say that it's important to think about a broader frame around addressing racial equity. I'm going to be talking more about structural racism and institutional racism, but I think you'll see the importance of understanding implicit bias and then what gives it power are policies and practices that are put in place that advantage some groups and disadvantage others. And then the other, I just want to give real credit to the Annie Casey Foundation. As Karen said, before I came to ABFE, I was a senior associate at Annie Casey and helped develop something called Race Matters. So much of what we use at ABFE really came from the work that I was privileged to do at the Annie Casey Foundation, a group that is still working hard on these issues because nobody's got it right. That's the one thing we have to remember. We're all still working hard at this. So to get us going, just to talk a little bit about how we look at racial equity. And often what we are doing at ABFE is helping people make the case about why it's important to focus on racial equity, whether or not you're doing health work, whether or not you're doing education work. And actually, we put together these points because, as mentioned before, folks typically will want to talk about anything else but race, right? Folks would rather talk about class. Folks would rather talk about place. And one of the more challenging conversations is, again, to talk about race. So we put together a set of starting assumptions that actually are meant to be talking points for many of our colleagues to use in their institutions. And the first is, and actually Karen queued me up, that race matters because it doesn't matter what work you're doing. Again, if it's education, if it's child welfare, if it's, you name it, justice, we see disparities based on race. Every indicator of well-being in all of the issues that we work on in the field of philanthropy that you all may be working on, we see disparities based on race. And yes, class matters too, because ultimately folks want to go straight to class. It's not race, it's class. Class matters too. All foundations that we work with at ABFE are critically concerned about reducing poverty, and we should be. But it's important to say that even when we control for class, on many indicators, we still see disparities based on race. So it's not either or, it's definitely both and we can't let race fall off the table. Clearly, place matters. There's a surgence in the field of philanthropy, probably over the last several years, about place-based initiatives, and that's critically important. Folks will focus on the south side of Chicago or east of the Anacostia River, often without talking about actually who lives there, right, which are predominantly people of color. And we know we live in a highly segregated country, and, but places are racialized. So it's, again, not that we're saying place doesn't matter, but we have to be very clear that places are racialized, right? We're in a highly segregated country. And then finally, we often hear from folks that it's not about race or class, it's really about personal responsibility. And we say, yes, that matters too, right? It's clearly a parent's job to raise their child. But we know certain parents or some parents have access to opportunity, live in places that are deemed high opportunity neighborhoods. And choices that parents make have a lot to do with the experiences and the options they have to raise their kids. So when we talk about racial equity and we talk about focusing in on race and going through the door of race, we're not trying to say that none of these other things matter, but that clearly, and we've seen it over and over again, many of these other issues, race will fall off the table, quite frankly, faster than many of these other issues will. So we actually give folks those talking points to talk about why we need to sort of focus on all of it. A few other starting assumptions in terms of making the case and the case building for racial equity. Disparities are often created and maintained through policies and practices that contain barriers to opportunity for people of color. And again, taking into consideration what we now understand about implicit bias, these are policies that are developed by human beings, right, that aren't necessarily primed for or looking at how certain policies might impact folks of different racial ethnic groups. So our work at ABFE, though, really focuses on looking at the role of policies in this country and how they disadvantage communities of color and perhaps advantage white communities. The second point really lifts up this notion of intentionality, and I love that I followed behind you guys. You have to look for it. You have to look for it because we're primed not to look at the impact of policies and practice on race. So if we want to close health racial equity gaps, if we want to close educational gaps around race or between communities of color and white colleagues, we have to talk about it, right? And we have to be intentional. I've got some tools that we'll share with you that helps us be intentional. And then this last point really is the point of optimism. I actually have that as well because we have seen over and over again that there are more folks out there than we think that are interested and concerned about addressing issues of equity, but they need support, they need information, they need knowledge and skills and tools. So I actually think we're in a place where we have folks that want to do this work, but just need to be supported in a good way to do it. So in addition to what we say to foundations when we're working with them is that not only do you need shared language, and I'll get to some points around definition and the like, to have a productive conversation about racial equity, you also have to have a shared point of view, right? And there are many perspectives and points of view out there, but this is a little bit about how we think about it at ABFE, and it's one that is evidence-based and has a lot of research behind it. And that is that this country has historical patterns of policies and practices and media messages and images to bolster them. We just saw some of that, right? That result in the exclusion, marginalization, and control of black people. And I say black people because of who we are, but you could substitute people of color there. I'm just talking about who we are at ABFE. And these persist sometimes in new forms up to today. And again, when you look across sort of sectors or issue areas, we can come up with, if I asked you guys to shout out some, you probably could as well, but we could come up with, again, policies and practices that disadvantage communities of color. Right, so when you look in the area of education, there are many to think about. I'll just lift up two. One, school discipline policies that disproportionately impact students of color, that lead to disproportionate push out of students of color. Again, a lot of this has to do with what we're ingrained in thinking and believing about different students, and then putting policies in place that actually disadvantage students of color. Another might be school funding formulas in this country that still distribute school district funds based on home values. Right? And knowing that housing values in communities of color are worth less. And we still have a number of school districts around this country that distribute their district funds based on home ownership values. And that's how you get to the schools that have less money, they're underfunded, less prepared teachers and the like. So I'm sure there are more in the area of education. In the area of workplace, I just left a conversation with one foundation that was looking for, they were hiring, and they were looking for a new director of their national child advocacy and policy portfolio. And one of the criterion for the job was that the person had to have run a statewide child advocacy and policy portfolio. Well, if you take a cursory look across the country as to who's running statewide child advocacy and policy organizations, it's not diverse at all. So just that one policy actually sort of discredited or sort of screened out a number of people. But there are, again, multiple. I just went down to a very specific foundation, one particular workplace, but there are multiple sort of policies and practices that we can think about in terms of workplace that disadvantage communities of color and have over time. In the area of public systems, in the area of justice, many of you may know about the different sentencing policies for crack versus powder, cocaine, all right? Crack being a cheaper version of the drug, actually more sort of used in poorer communities that are disproportionately communities of color, but yet have harsher sentencing policies than crack. right, in the powder form that's used in sort of more well-off neighborhoods. So there are a number of examples, again, of policies and practices historically and up to today, I didn't go all the way back, up to today, actually that disadvantage communities of color. And then finally in media, and our colleagues before me actually just talked a little bit about sort of images that we see and why we've got to know that this is ingrained, right, in us, in our head, and that's people of color and white colleagues. And so when people say they don't see color, it's actually not humanly possible not to see color given the society that we live in. So just a few points about media portrayal. The 4 points on that one side are basically what research shows about, as our colleagues mentioned, about how people of color are portrayed in the media. And the 2 points above the picture actually are really the devastating impacts. Just 2 points here, devastating impacts of media portrayal. And I loved your pictures. I pulled this one with LeBron James, and I think her name is Giselle, who is an international model, and how close it looks to the picture on the other side, which is, what's his name? King Kong. Yeah, King Kong. So I want to skip a few. Let me go this. We're talking about health, right? So how many of you all out there have heard about David Williams from out of Yale University? Oh my gosh, check him out. One colleague, check him out. I just heard him speak. I did not know about his work. He has a TED Talk. And if you can, check out his TED Talk. His name is David Williams. He created something called the Everyday Discrimination Scale. And that scale has been used to collect research on people of different races that have experienced things like being treated with less courtesy, receiving poor service, right? Being treated like you're not smart. People act afraid of you. These very small, sort of subtle sort of forms of discrimination that some people call microaggressions, right? Everyday sort of small, subtle forms of racism. Tanae Lewis, who is out of Emory University, actually has used the scale and has begun to organize research that shows how everyday discrimination actually shows up in health outcomes, right, for people of color. So I really encourage you to go deeper, to look at Dr. Williams' work, check out his TED Talk. There's another actual documentary that is great. Hopefully you've heard of it. It's called Is Racism Making Us Sick? That was produced by California Newsreel that does a lot of this as well, helps us associate sort of the impact of discrimination on health outcomes. So I want to move from case making and just a few sort of comments about definitions, because I think, again, it's important that as we sort of get into this work around equity, we really use all the opportunities we have to build our competencies, really, around race and racism. And we use this sort of this wheel, or cogs in a wheel, actually, to help folks understand different forms of racism. And it's important, if we're talking about equity and health equity, to understand these concepts, because the strategies for addressing them are actually very different, right? So if I start with personally mediated racism, this is basically personal prejudice, personal bias. This is where the implicit bias sort of fits in our sort of scheme, because personally mediated racism can be implicit, could be explicit, could be conscious, could be unconscious. And if I move to institutional and structural, this is more about the policies and practices of institutions, actually, that, again, disadvantage some communities and advantage others. There's internalized racism. This is the most harmful, I believe, of all, when the stigmatized group basically drinks the Kool-Aid and believes they are less than or not worthy. And then there's white privilege, right? A set of privileges that come along with whiteness. Many of you may know of Peggy McIntosh's work called, it's about a knapsack. I can't remember the name of it, Unpacking the Privilege Knapsack. And she talks about sort of white privilege, and I also have to read these because these things aren't familiar to me, but I actually best define it as examples, and she gives a few. When you see people of your race widely represented on TV or media. 2, you can be assured that your children will be given curriculum materials that testify to their existence or race. 3, when you don't have to worry about being asked to speak for all people in your race. And 4, if a cop pulls you over, you can be sure it's not because of your race. She's got some really helpful ways to understand privilege. So just in summary, as we go through the sessions this afternoon, be thinking about these different forms of racism and how, in fact, they can be addressed when you're thinking about health equity and health outcomes. And the last definition, actually, I'll use is one on racial equity in particular, and I think this can be used interchangeably, quite frankly, with gender equity, you name it. And we say it's both doable and measurable. This is actually some data, and the data points actually don't matter. I know you can't see this too well, from an NEKC Foundation body of work in Portland, Oregon, looking at the numbers of juvenile lockup, actually. And the attempt was to actually reduce the number of kids that were being sent to prison. And on your right-hand side was actually using a racial equity frame. The left-hand side was actually using some very explicit tools in Portland, Oregon, to actually reduce the number of kids going to lockup or to more adult prisons, quite frankly. And what you see is when we talk about racial equity, we're talking about making outcomes better for everybody, right? So the numbers come down for everybody while simultaneously closing the gap between actually the right-hand side, the orange are Latino kids, and the white, and the left side is white children. So we want to make the world better for everybody, but simultaneously reduce the gap. So our definition is almost like a set of results we're seeking for. Racial equity is achieved when you can't predict advantage and disadvantage by race, right? I could say the same thing about gender equity is achieved when you can't predict advantage or disadvantage by race. You can't look at a chart like we all can do today, right? If we're looking at outcomes, be it graduation, you name it, and know those are the black kids, those are the Latino kids, those are the white kids, right? When we can't predict advantage or disadvantage. Just a very quick, again, in the spirit of learning, that there are many ways to work on equity, health equity, racial equity. Our focus at ABFE is on structural racism in particular, but I raise this because I think we all need to get competent and stronger on different strategies. There's a really good resource by a woman by the name of Alana Shapiro. It's called Training for Racial Equity. It's actually kind of old, but it was very helpful to me years ago. That actually goes through different approaches to work on equity and also gives you the name of consultants and organizations that can help train up your organizations, your foundations, and the like on these issues. But you see prejudice reduction, healing and reconciliation, which is sort of what happened in South Africa, actually happening in many communities in the South, that suggests that we can't heal and move on until we recognize past acts of wrongdoing, like, when that cop shot that black kid 10 years ago and nobody talked about it. We have to talk about that so we can heal and move on. There's diversity and multiculturalism, democracy building, and civic engagement. Again, all of these are ways in which we can get smarter and stronger on issues of equity. So I am going to close with a few points about philanthropy and a couple of tools. So, we're working in a sector where we've got some steep hills to climb, but I don't think it's, quite frankly, much different for philanthropy as a sector than other sectors in this country. One is that many of you may know, that foundation leaders don't reflect the nation's diversity. So we're often talking with foundations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We don't yet even have the diversity in the field that we need. I think it's the last data I saw, 80% of all full-time paid staff are white. That's 2015 data coming out of the Council of Foundations. The other point that Karen made, communities of color are underfunded. It is in case in 2014, only 7.4% of all dollars granted by foundations in this country were targeted for people of color-led organizations. And historically, since data has been collected by the council and a number of other groups, that number has never exceeded 8.5%. Now, foundations give out about $40 billion every year, right? 7.4% going to organizations led by people of color, and that figure has never exceeded 8.5%. Also, there are issues around competency in our field. Again, I don't think that's any different around other sectors. And there's this tricky piece around accountability, that foundations pretty much have opportunities to move money where they like. Nonetheless, we are actually seeing some progress in foundations being more intentional to address equity. And so when we talk about being intentional, there are three things, there are probably more, but I just leave you with as relates to how do you take these ideas and make them apply to the work that's on your desk. One is a greater use of disaggregated data disaggregated by race to design policies and programs. And whether this is data on health indicators, it's important to say disaggregated by race and disaggregated by ethnicity. So it's not enough, in our opinion, for our colleagues in the field of philanthropy to be talking about black communities solely. But we want to further disaggregate that to talk about the different populations within our community, right? Black immigrants actually have very different experiences than native-born black folks, right? So we want to know not only about African Americans, but African immigrants that are here, Caribbean immigrants that are here. So disaggregation of data is really a first step in doing equity work so you can target and design programs specific to populations. The second is analyzing the impact of any proposed policy and program on communities of color. And then the third is messaging opportunities and challenges facing communities of color. And I'll end with this slide. So these are the tools that we developed when I was at NECASey. All of these tools are on the CASey website. And we use them with foundations that we work with across the country. And those 3 points about intentionality, focus on data, analyze the impact of policies and programs on people, and message race productively, really are the 3 tools that are lined up here. The first tool, actually, what's called What's Race Got to Do with It, helps folks develop what we call a race-informed theory of change and identify policies that might be driving those bad health outcomes for communities of color. And we've all seen theories of change, and if you start with the disparity data, say birth outcomes or infant mortality for black women or Latino women, this tool actually helps an organization, a community, right, identify what might be the policies that are driving that bad outcome that have the adverse effect on Latinos and African Americans. So that's the first tool. The second, I think, is the most powerful tool and a tool that we can all pick up today and use now. It's a racial equity impact analysis. Again, we're not primed to look at the impact of policies and programs and our decisions on different racial ethnic groups. A racial equity impact analysis is akin to an environmental impact analysis that suggests before we do anything to the land, we need to think about what the impact might be. Well, a racial equity impact analysis says before we do anything to people, we should really think about what the impact might be. And there are several states that have now legislated and now require racial equity impact analyses to be carried out publicly. Iowa is one, Connecticut is another, particularly in the area of criminal justice and sentencing in particular, so that there's thoughtful conversation, right, about what might be the impact, what might be the unintended consequences of these policies on different population groups and particularly communities of color. And then the last tool, and I'd be happy to talk about any of these in the conversation further, is a tool that we call How to Talk About Race. There's great work being done or has been done around messaging race that helps us to understand how you can frame race that actually keeps people at the table, keeps them engaged, doesn't have folks go running out of the room, and most importantly, doesn't blame the people, particularly the people of color, about what's happening to them. So again, the good news is that there are tools, there are resources out there. Would be happy to share more, but I think I got that 1 minute sign about 3 minutes ago. So I want to thank you for your attention and thank you for what you're doing. Thank you.